In October 1979, there was an Evening Post article featuring heritage architect Chris Cochran, who was looking for a home for the Shamrock Hotel. Lion Breweries intended to demolish the building and sell the valuable Molesworth and Hawkstone Street corner site. I saw this as an interesting challenge, so I became involved. I negotiated to remove the building and bought a site for it at 224 to 232 Tinakori Road. That site was empty, except for one old house at 224, which became part of the development. A sign was placed on the site advertising successfully for shop tenants. 2 Wellington City Council planning hearings and 2 appeals to the Town and Country Planning Tribunal later, all wasting 18 months, I was ready to go. One appellant, Helen Hitchings, who lived further up Tinakori Road, talked of her front yard becoming a urinal and a vomitorium for the customers of the restaurant. The earliest reference to the Galatea dates from 1866. The Galatea, later called the Shamrock, was in extremely poor condition by the early 1890s and was demolished and replaced in 1893. By 1980, it was again decrepit. Built of timber to sustain earthquakes, its side walls were galvanized corrugated iron as firewalls. Brick buildings had proven to be dangerous in earthquake-prone Wellington. I contracted T.R. Parry & Co. to move the building. The traffic department, not amalgamated with the police at that time, initially refused permission for them to bring their antiquated equipment into the city. The tyres on the 4 bogies were all old and worn. This was to prove a serious problem later as the building moved onto its final site. The main vehicles Parry's owned were a huge and powerful ex-logging truck out of Kaingaroa Forest, the tractor unit, and 2 Ford 4x4 lighting trucks from the Second World War. The building was braced internally with large steel beams bolted on top and under the floor joist running east-west. North-south beams at right angles to these and the width of the building were bolted under the east-west beams. The beams on which the whole assembly was to roll sideways out onto Hawkstone Street were lifted under the north-south beams under the building. What was left of the 1870s basement was then demolished. 4 sets of bogies of double-axle twin tyres were lifted underneath and bolted to the east-west beams. The steel beams were jacked so that the building rose to a level where the wheels would be above Hawkstone Street. 2 of my carpenters worked through the whole move, doing minor carpentry, helping the movers, and labouring. In conjunction with preparing the building, the new site was being readied. This new site was levelled and a crib wall built at its rear. Steel railway irons were driven into the ground, about 8 to 10 metres deep, around the perimeter and along the centre line of where the building would finally sit. Concrete ground beams were then built on top to ground level so that the tractor unit could tow its load over the top. Concrete nib walls were later laid once the building was sitting on blocks and the building lowered onto these foundations after its underside had been rebuilt. The house at 224 was upgraded at this time too. Come Saturday 26th of September 1981, a fine day for the move, the bottom cross beams were extended right out onto Hawkstone Street. The trucks were then set up on the street and began winching the building across and onto the street. The old trucks were extremely tough and strong. However, if they stalled, the batteries needed to be jump-started. The building began to move, rolling gently over the Hawkstone Street footpath. All looked well. The rollers between the 2 sets of cross beams needed to be removed from the rear of the beams and placed under the front as the building rolled sideways. Unfortunately, nobody had foreseen that once the building had moved out, the cantilevered ends of the 2 upper cross beams would bend down slightly but enough to stop the next roller passing between the 2 cross beams. A reasonably simple fix would have been to gas torch the end of the top beam to make a slight wedge effect, allowing the roller to begin its entry. What was unforeseen was that the gas would run out just then, and this was 1981 on a Saturday, and all businesses were closed, so no gas was available. At this stage, Tom Parry, then 78, and his son Dave, then about 52, threw up their hands. This was a fairly tense time with everyone running around frantically, and from that point I pretty much controlled operations. The traffic cop looking after traffic control was becoming the tensest person on site. In the end, we decided to cancel the operation until the next day. The next day, Sunday, was a howling southerly. The Ministry of Works would not allow high wind loads on the motorway bridge, and the building remained stuck halfway across Hawkstone Street until the Tuesday. The southerly had nearly passed by that time, with frequent rain squalls. A balloon light fitting had been left hanging from upstairs by some past tenant, and it added an amusing note to the depressing weather. The building halves, lightened by removing everything inside, looked very forlorn in the rain. The rear of the building was both plain and very dilapidated. The move began again with a nice taper under the front edges of the crossbeam fixed under the building. On this moving day, which started at 5 a.m, the first thing to happen was that the front wheel assembly fell off the Ferguson tractor, the tractor being the only movable hydraulic pump. From then on, every time a corner was to be turned, long hoses had to be arranged to each jacking point from the tractor unit, a very slow process. The beams were again laid out and the process of the week before repeated. This time it proved to be a successful move of the building out onto Hawkstone Street. The workers greased the rollers and my team worked their tails off. Of Parry's team, Tom and Dave really did much of the heavy lifting. The slide out onto the street was not without drama. The old equipment was frequently not up to the job, and my trusty turfer again did a huge amount of work and was never the same again. Once it had been slid out as far as required onto the street, the building was then jacked up slightly, the two cross beams removed, and the whole assembly lowered down onto the bogie wheels. The tractor unit was set under the gooseneck in preparation for the tow. It was an incredibly powerful truck with two gearboxes to allow it to travel at a snail's pace where necessary. The driver, Buzz Vero, again a fairly old man, was absolutely precise in his positioning, a real expert. The gooseneck, adjustable for height, holding the load onto the rear of the truck, showed huge stress from its first use. A chain was added to take some of the load, but this, later, like much of the moving equipment, proved inadequate. Telephone and power wires and 4 poles needed to be moved, not once, but 3 times in all. And of course, they all needed to be moved back afterwards. The weather became progressively more wet and cold. Though the wind was less, the rain never stopped falling. The traffic cops were very useful, though expensive. The show was on the road. Tom Parry went to the new site during the move and hammered down the reinforcing steel so that his big truck would not be damaged moving the load onto the site. Crowds found the move fascinating. There were always many spectators along the footpath. Barriers for the public were fairly rudimentary. Nowadays, there would be distance between them and the work in case someone got hurt. This was the time of the Springbok tour of New Zealand, and our work area, being near Parliament, had been a scene of violent protest. My wife Roberta kept the crew fed, and our sons, Alistair, nearly 7, and Chris, 11, took great interest in the operation. As the Ministry of Works insisted that the load needed to be shared between both sides of the motorway bridge, the tractor unit pulling the load needed to span the centre median. The median was too high for the truck, so blocks of wood needed to be placed under its wheels. They were moved forward progressively, an extremely exhausting exercise. Wellingtonians, oblivious to the drama, continued on their wet day. Some motorway users must have had a shock seeing a building crossing above their heads. The truck finally finished the bridge crossing and moved to the corner of Hawkstone Street and Tinakori Road. At this point, the building needed to be jacked up, the bogies under it rotated to go around the corner, it was again jacked and the bogies straightened to travel down Tinakori Road. The trip down Tinakori Road was largely uneventful, except that one complete streetlight pole needed to be removed to allow the swing into the site. Arriving at the new site, the positioning of the truck and load were critical to get the correct line onto the site. Again, the building had to be jacked, The bogies all rotated to steer around the corner, and the building lowered onto its wheels and pulled forward onto the site. This took 2 steps, a slow process given that there was only the one hydraulic pump, and that was on the big truck. As the first wheels in the bogies reached the curb, they just dug straight through the footpath as though it was putty. The elderly tyres began to burst one after the other until about half of them had blown. This, of course, put more load onto the gooseneck. The forces involved in the gooseneck just became too great. With a great bang, both sides of the gooseneck snapped, the chain broke, and the load slumped down onto the ground. Obviously, this was a major disaster for all. The head of Wellington Traffic Police was on site at this time, and he blew a fuse. He insisted that we get a bulldozer to demolish the building onto the site and off Tinakori Road. He and I had a heated discussion, the outcome of which was that we were given until 5 p.m. the following day to be off Tinakori Road. 3 of Wellington's largest tow trucks were called in next morning and repairs carried out on the gooseneck. Unfortunately, the cameras did not roll for this operation. The building was bodily pulled onto the site and into approximately its final position. From the Hill Street overbridge, the Shamrock, even if it was only half there, looked impressive. It had reached its new home. The verandas had already been made, ready to be lifted onto the inner face of the courtyard. Tom and I, at this stage, would have most likely been having a discussion about who was paying for what, given the last few days of drama. Once in place, the building was positioned accurately with jacks and was then reconstructed underneath before being dropped down into place. There were old pipes to remove and quite a lot of timber replaced to support the building on its new concrete foundations. While our building crews began work on the first half of the building, Parry's took their equipment back for the second half. This was a lot smaller and lighter, so it could be dropped directly onto 2 bogies and towed off the site. Everything worked perfectly for this move. Wires still had to be moved and traffic managed, but the problems had been and gone. At the top of the ramp, the adjustable turntable needed to be lifted to balance the load. This time, there had been a lot of welding added to the gooseneck assembly. Again, the centre median of the motorway bridge needed to be packed for the truck, as the Ministry of Works still insisted on sharing the load over the bridges. The load followed the same route down Tinakori Road, but because there were only 2 bogie sets under it, no jacking was required to turn corners. The old site was left looking very empty. The very old concrete slabs and rubbish were part of my demolition contract, and the site was later cleared. The second half of the building was pulled up alongside its site and was slid sideways in the same way as the first section was slid onto Hawkstone Street. The whole moving operation was dangerous work, but the movers walked fearlessly under these very large loads, even while they moved along the road. Given the 40-odd years since this operation to putting together this film, such a level of safety would never be countenanced now under current health and safety laws. Imagine what we'll be unable to do in another 40 years. Work on the building's restoration, the addition of the verandas, and the lean-tos at each end were all completed in about 2.5 months. The brick courtyard was completed last, hours before the opening function on the 8th of December 1981. Trees, some quite large ones bought from National Park, have prospered in the warm and sheltered surrounds behind the Shamrock. This move could have been accomplished using the brand new hydraulic technology which was just becoming available at the time. However, the cost of that Hamilton-based equipment was prohibitive, and the low technology of the move used by Parry suited the building perfectly. Even though Tom's equipment was in a sorry state, he must still be credited with doing a great job. So many problems were solved with time, patience, and hard work. The building began its new life with an excellent restaurant, 2 shops, and Prue Newton's plant shop in the added conservatory. There were 3 flats upstairs, and the original house at 224 Tinakori Road was linked into the courtyard with a healthcare shop downstairs and a flat upstairs. After we sold the Shamrock, the complex was later unit titled. This is actually a good outcome for the Shamrock, making it much harder for demolition to ever be possible. It is listed with both Wellington City Council and Historic Places Trust as an heritage building. It has had a couple of different colour schemes, generally keeping its Irish flavour intact.